default. And it looks like it's working there. Device is Intel Yeti something something. All right, you guys should be able to hear me better. All right, well, at least you saw the words, so that's good. Maybe that's why people were popping out of there. I believe my sound is back working, so that should be good. You guys should be able to hear me. But on the plus side, you could at least see the words across the bottom during all that. So yeah, a little bit about me. I'm a guy who's done a bunch of stuff, and that's going to inform my talk here about what we're working on. All right, so with that in mind, let me see if there's anything else I want to talk about over here. All right, good. We'll get into it. All right, and again, this talk, I even told the guys in the Linux group when we did the talk this weekend, all the other people were there to talk about the fields that they were in, and you know, a whole bunch of Linux and all that kind of stuff. And the channel is dedicated to Linux, and the professional Linux users group is all about Linux. But this talk has very little to do with Linux at all. It's just about engineering and why we can call ourselves engineers, even if Canada doesn't agree. So, all right, anyways, let's get into it a little bit. So, why engineering, right? Because we've got this thing called the scientific method. Some of you have probably heard of this. Some of you have probably argued with people online about what's a repeatable thing that can be seen. And then we get down into the idea of how do we know something to be true? Like, how do I know it to be true that I have something in my hand right here? How do I know it to be true that I have a hand? How do I know, you know, like there's all these things that we talk about, like how we interact with things and how we know things to be true, right? And people will argue that we're in a simulation, and people will argue that we're in all these, there's all these things that people will argue about, right? That's what the internet's for, is to argue with people and look at questionable material, right? But so the science explains that the world works by making an observation, asking a question, forming a hypothesis from that question, making a prediction, testing that prediction, and then iterating, where we keep circling through that thing until we get to what we believe is as sound an answer as we can, right? And one of the things I love about engineering is that I tell people all the time, as engineers, we put science into practice probably more than anybody else. Like, we take sound principles and then we put them into our systems, and we put them into practice, and we understand, like, there's going to be a part here where we talk about communication, and we understand how communication occurs, so then we can understand where it breaks, and then we could figure out all these types of pieces about it. So anyways, we're going to talk about engineering in the sense of this, like informed by the light of kind of how science looks at things. So engineering puts all of those things that people are observing and practicing into repeatable practice, right? That's a big part of what we do as engineers. That's a big part of, I guess, engineering in general. So why engineering is because we take science and we put it into repeatable practice. Okay, that's my general high-level definition of engineering, right? So why engineering? Again, a little bit of tongue-in-cheek, but because it's not being a doctor, right? Ooh, brother, what is that? You don't got to look at stuff that's questionable and bulging and pussy and that kind of stuff. We don't need to look at any of that kind of stuff. But did not say the word pus. Pus isn't a bad word. Anyways. But yeah, so it's not being a lawyer. We don't have to memorize a bunch of little things and look at all this other stuff that's kind of going on, like, you know, stare decisis and let the decision stand, and understand all the various forms of case law that have come before it and that kind of stuff. We don't have to do all that, right? We're engineers. We have picked a different path, right? And our path is to take things that are understood by science and turn them into repeatable processes, right? So the question I keep asking is, why engineering, right? It's not being a doctor. It's not being a lawyer. Well, why engineering, right? Businesses run on repeatable, accurate processes. And Deming, this guy Edwards Deming, he once said, if you can't describe everything you do as a process, you don't know what you're doing. And I really like that. Edwards Deming is kind of the father of Six Sigma and total quality management. He's generally regarded as an early pioneer in that space. And then Peter Drucker said, if it can be measured, it can be improved, right? Deming also famously said one that I don't have here, but it was in God we trust and all others bring data. And the point of that is, wherever you fall on these other spectrum, is to say, if we want to make something better, if we want to track things and improve them and do these things, we need to have data. And we can sit around and argue all day about things. And it's actually one of the things you'll notice if you ever do watch how people argue online. Maybe you take a class in debate and then you watch how people don't debate properly. One of the main things people do is they talk about different metrics. It's like, I'm going to look at how big the data is in like population samples, and you're going to argue just the quality of it. And we're just going to talk past each other and argue. And that's why most debates are never fruitful in general, that and not being able to define terms. But that's neither here nor there to the talk. But engineering in general is about describing everything you do as a process, breaking things down into the component pieces, and then being able to repeat those, right? So again, Drucker had the insight of if you can measure it, it can be improved. And Deming said everything, you should be able to break it down into the individual processes. And if you can't do that, you don't know what you're doing. And I agree with that in so many aspects of life, not just engineering, right? That's a big part of it. Another way that people say it is if you can't do it slow, you can't do it fast. That's a way that people sometimes say these same concepts. But so why engineering, right? So why engineering then, right? And I say because with engineering, we can build engines. Engines are things that cycle. Engines are things that have a definite start and a definite end, and then they spin through those things. That's what an engine does, right? It starts with some part of a cycle, and maybe we're used to actual, cycling engines of like gas or electric power, and they have a definitive way that they work where they step through the phases. So I have an example here of an 8-function cycle. I've known this cycle most of my adult life. In fact, probably since I was 18, I first learned it. But without even worrying about what it is, the cycle of this thing is to feed, chamber, lock, fire, unlock, extract, eject, and cock. I can do that without the numbers there, right? I know the order of that thing very well. I was an armorer with it. So I understand that. And we can understand that engines always have inputs to the individual functions in their cycle. And they have processing and outputs, right? That's actually right there, that input, process, output. Those three things are how we define computer science, right? Anybody here ever done any computer science stuff or computer engineering? Literally everything's an input, process, and output. When we go into the business side of things and then we start to interact, we expand the input, process, outputs to also have our suppliers and our customers. And what that helps us to do is inform that, like, I may build an API. In fact, we had a really awesome talk by one of our engineers on this last weekend that was about the API building process. And as a engineer, he understands very well the input, process, and outputs of his API, right? But then we also have to be informed of how our suppliers are going to send that information in. How are the customers on the far end going to get that data back out? And is that going to be an acceptable format? Now we have defined formats for how we do all this passing of data and that kind of stuff. Sure. But the point is, we do input, process, output in a cycle. We have suppliers and customers that sometimes pull things out as we go. And because of engineering, we can build cycles, or we can build engines that cycle through functions of things. That's a big part of what we do, right? Lots of words to say we build engines as engineers. Kind of makes sense, right? If we can break things down like that then, right? Like if we can understand this, then it helps us to inform every other part of what we do. Back to this idea of we can describe everything as a process so we know what we're doing. We can measure it and then we can improve it, right? And that's going to kind of inform the next few slides then around engineering. So again, why engineering? Well, because if I have a system like this, I can model and teach and understand things. So I can, if I wanted to sit here and talk to you about this thing that feeds, chambers, locks, fires, unlocks, extracts, ejects, and cocks, I don't have to pull this thing up and then show it to you and go, did you catch that part right there? Okay, yeah, we just did the whole cycle. Actually, the cycle takes about, it stops until you do 4. But the whole process can take about half a second, maybe even a little less than that, the whole thing. And I'm like, did you catch it? Did you catch it? No, we can break it down, and then we could just talk for the next 5 minutes about feeding. How do things feed? Well, the feeding takes about a third of a second, maybe a little less. Takes an object that's exactly 5.56 millimeters. Can't be bigger than that, can't be smaller than that. It'll affect the next pieces of it. Feeding occurs only in the first step of the cycle, never anywhere else. Sometimes when these devices malfunction, people say, there was a double feed. But there's not a double feed because the feed can only happen once. It's actually, in that case, a failure to extract or eject typically, right? But my point is not even talking about what this item is. It's just we can model this thing. I don't even have to tell you what it is. And we can model it, and then we can start to break down the component pieces of it. One that I'm going to show you later that we use to teach is the OSI model. And the OSI model, we could just pull one slide up and talk about it for like, I could probably talk to the OSI model for like 10 hours. I don't need notes or anything. Been teaching that thing so long. And it's the same way here. We can just focus in on this for this session, and then we go to this for this session, and we talk about all the little proclivities and things that happen with it. In fact, when we get into securing things, we're going to focus on each individual part of the communication model so that we can understand it. But my point is we can model systems and then teach and understand what's going on. So that's useful, right? It's useful to understand that that's how that works. All right. So then why engineering? Well, we can report output for variability. If we know that each of these functions here within this cycle can have inputs and processes and outputs from the previous cycles, we can get to this one part of it, maybe firing, and the output that comes from that along the cycles of this engine is maybe as we do tests, we measure components and something happens there where there's something that leaves this engine at somewhere between 2,295 feet per second through 2,303 feet per second across our 4,000 tests. And we could start to then model output and variability of the system. Now, what can we then do with that, right? If I can model data, and I can do like my brother Tom did this weekend where he talked about you pull in a bunch of data and then you figure out what the key performance indicators are of it. Well, I can start to look at this and then I can start to determine, are these things within the tolerances that I want, right? Well, so if I can record output and variability, again, the question is why engineering? Then we can look for variability and try to improve the individual parts of the process, right? So we've got this same firing with these same values here. And within these component pieces here, we can start to measure maybe a center line of output, like here's our average, and then we start to have upper control limits and lower control limits about the, size of things. There's all kinds of things we can do to measure the output of things and then have upper and lower control limits put to those to verify that things are around where we expect. And then once we understand that output, we can start to deal with inputs and we can start to control outputs of things, which is actually a function of what we call hacking systems, but we'll get into that. We can have distributions of data then, right? So this is a histogram, and the histogram maybe has the mean here. We start to talk about mean, median, and mode, which are variability within data sets, right? So with histograms, we start to block the data sets into groupings, and we say how close is the data, how close does it appear to be to a median, and then we start to talk about what are the number of deviations away from the mean. And typically when you have like one standard deviation in a normally distributed set like this, one standard deviation away contains like, I want to say it's like 66.6% of the data or something, or of all outcomes. And then I think over here is like 87.3 or something. You can look that up. And then over here at 3 standard distributions away from the mean on a normal distributed chart is like 99.7 or something like that. So you can look that up, but it's mostly all occurrences of data. And then you have high outliers and low outliers, and sometimes you understand why those things occurred the way they did. Hey, Enzo Bear, how's it going? We're just recording something that I didn't record this weekend and just kind of talking through it. The wife's gone for another hour and a half, so I'm just kind of talking with you guys and hanging out a little bit. I'm on call and I'm watching my other system, but nothing's going on. It's all quiet right now, so that's good. So again, engineering can model variability and improve individual components of an engine. And one of the cool things about as we break things down is I can fix maybe this part of it or change certain components of this without affecting other pieces. That's what we call modularity. When I can update or change one component in a system or in an engine, I can then upgrade something without affecting other pieces, which is an awesome. That's an awesome. I don't want to say like superpower, but it's awesome because then we can get to whatever standards or whatever kind of goals we're driving for, but without having to scrap the whole thing and start over. So that's kind of an important thing. So again, we can with engineering we can model variability and improve things, right? Then with engineering, we can log and checkpoint, right? So some of you guys have built things or done engineering in some way around systems where we log and we checkpoint things. So maybe a good log, right? And we talk about this in our security engineering course. Good logging always has a timestamp. Timestamp should be in a format that's understood. Very common formats that have come out and kind of won this battle are like the ISO 8601 standards and those kind of things. But we timestamp maybe here at chambering, and we say at this exact time chambering was complete, so feeding has occurred, we know we got to chambering. Then we get all the way through the cycle and we get to the end and we timestamp that the cycle was complete at the end of cocking, and then we're back to feeding again or whatever the next part of our process is, right? So if you can log and checkpoint things, then it might stand to reason that the next thing that comes from that is we can troubleshoot. What if we get to chambering and then it's kind of like yada 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 and then we don't get to cocking? So you say, why do you say yada yada yada? It's like I'm not telling you the story, I'm just letting you fill it in yourself. Well, think about this for a second, because some of you are immediately seeing what the problem is here. Well, there's maybe two problems: the problem that actually caused something to break, and then what's the other problem? People might be able to see it real quick. Well, the problem is that you only have this one logging and this one logging. So anywhere in here we could have had a break, right? I don't know if it broke here, and I don't know if it broke here. All I know is it didn't get down to here. It didn't complete here when the cycle was finished. So if that's the point, I come down here, we can start to think about granularity and resolution in our monitoring. So how we monitor things and how often, because some of you immediately saw this and went, why aren't we timestamping at every step? I don't know. There's reasons not to. Maybe it costs too much. Maybe it's too granular and it's going to overload your system. But what if we could add one timestamp at firing, because we're already tracking maybe firing and the output of the process for the feet per second. So now we can maybe track here, and then if we don't get down to the end of the cycle, we know that we at least got the first 4 to pass. We still have a problem down here, and we got to go figure it out. But now we have granularity and resolution, so we can exonerate these ones. Exonerate is the correct term for getting past these and not looking at them anymore. And this is the thing that we would then go and start to figure out what's going on in that data, right? And the timestamp doesn't just have to be that things are complete. Timestamps and logging can include all of those values we talked about earlier. Maybe we find that when something was only 2297 feet per second, that then we sometimes have a problem with extracting and ejecting because there's not enough maybe backwards pressure. And we start to, again, we're using this in a very abstract, so we're not even talking about what this 8-cycle function thing actually is, but we can start to go and examine more and more of it as we learn more about the engine that we're dealing with, and maybe that starts to inform us these things that we do know that are coming out and what our troubleshooting kind of looks like. All right, so why engineering? We can think about granularity and resolution and monitoring. Then we get down here, we can start to hack things. If we have an engine, right, the technical term for hacking is a process of understanding a system, typically by testing input. That's kind of hard for you guys to see. I'll move it back up here in a second. By testing input and output behavior to map system functions. So I have something that maybe I don't understand well. I don't understand like what it's actually doing, or I've only gotten the manual out about it, and I've been reading through the man pages about it. But hacking away at a system is dealing with putting inputs into the system until you've mapped the functions of what you get as an output. So if something's like a black box to you, like some tool inside of a bash shell or something like that, and you're typing in commands and it's just giving you things back out. Well, you're hacking away at that until you understand the functions of what you're putting into it, right? Too many people nowadays think hacking is just getting into systems, and that's not even remotely close to true. In fact, the industry calls that cracking, but people don't like being called crackers. They prefer being called hackers, right? But hacking in of itself is an engineering function. It's a subset of engineering. But we can hack. So if I understand, or I'm trying to understand this thing, I can start to randomly put in different data, and then maybe if something made it to here, I put in some different size. I said earlier, it has to be exactly 5.56 millimeters, whatever this thing is that I'm working with. Maybe I make that a different size, and it makes it to here, and then it breaks, and it reports out with some error code. And then maybe I do something else, and I get a different error code over here. And then maybe I make it all the way to the end, and whatever that thing is that I did, again, whatever thing I'm messing with as a function, maybe it gives no error. And then I know that that is a clean run through of this thing. But again, now I'm hacking away at a system and just doing whatever I can to break it. And some of you might very quickly go, well, wait a minute. If it's my system, that's fine. It's very fine to do that on your own system. But we tend to not like when people do it on our systems, or it tends to be illegal nowadays to do that on other people's systems. So that starts to bring about, we can secure our system. Why would our system accept any of those inputs if they weren't from us? That's a really bad practice. Why would we allow people to test random structured input to our system? That's really bad. So maybe we turn off the ability to do that, except maybe if you have a key, right? You can get into our ProLUG labs, but you have to give me a key for it, or you have to present a password that you know for it. And then maybe you can't do any of these things anymore, and even if you could, I don't respond to them anymore. So now it truly is a black box, and it takes away that ability to hack, because hacking requires some kind of validation, some kind of data coming back to you from your testing of inputs, right? So we can start to secure our system within engineering, right? This is an 8-function system. We feed chamber lock fire. And then now we're no longer sending out these error codes. These error codes are made up, by the way. I actually modeled them after the HTTP error codes, but it doesn't really matter. So then we come down here. And if I'm stopping people from getting into my system and I'm securing it, maybe as I'm securing against intrusion, I can describe those events in a structured way. So we use this thing called the diamond model of intrusion analysis. And within the diamond model of intrusion analysis, I can describe the adversary coming against the victim over a socio-political axis. And I can talk about the infrastructure that was used versus the capabilities of the defender as the technology axis. So now I have these two different functions. King Buns, I actually mentioned you a little while ago. I didn't mention you by name, but I mentioned the API stuff. I was up here talking about here how you defined building APIs, but you also have to make sure that, as you understand more and more of this, that the people that are sending data in are sending data in correctly and also accepting data out correctly, right? Typically we use tools like JSON for a lot of that, but I actually mentioned you there, just, not you exactly by name, but from your talk. So with engineering, we can describe a structured way that intrusions occur and why they occur. We can understand that adversaries tend to attack victims for socio-political reasons. Sometimes they do it for the lulz. That's a real word. Sometimes they do it for the environment or whatever their cause is. It can be all kinds of things. Sometimes they do it for money. Money is a great motivator. Money, in economic speak, generates what we call a coincidence of wants. I want something, you want to sell it, but I don't have the other thing that you want, so you want money, so you can take it from me, so you can go buy that other thing you want. I don't have to do a barter system, that kind of stuff, right? And then infrastructure versus capability is again the capability of your system to defend against the infrastructure that the other person is going to use. And sometimes we talk about across the technology axis, which is not drawn here, but there's a technology axis. It would be how much do they have to use to get into your system? Good use. Yeah. Again, this model tends to be called the diamond model of intrusion analysis. It's kind of the standard for how that's done, especially around military and government, U.S. government type reports on this. So that's all cool and all, but why engineering, right? That's been the question kind of pervading my talk here. And engineering can model communication. So this model, I was taught this in school, and then I show this to my college students. And for 17 years, I've been showing this to people and saying, show me a simpler model that works still. Show me an ant talking to another ant with chemicals that's simpler than this, and I'll show you a system that doesn't work. Show me satellites communicating. This is the bare minimum that works in communication. There can be no communication with only 3 of them, or even 4 of them. It takes all 5 to have simple communication work. Now, some people might just say, but wait a minute, Scott, hold on. To have effective communication, we need a 6th one called the feedback loop, and I would agree with you, yes. There is a thing that's different than the simple communication model called the effective communication model. We're not getting into it today, but that requires a 6th one, which is a feedback loop. All effective communication occurs with feedback. That's so you know. But simple communication, if I just have a piece of data here and I need to move it to over here in some way, I need these 5 components to exist. Well, I need 4 of the components to exist, and the 5th one will always exist no matter what we do. We've been trying to get rid of the 5th one forever. You can't do it. There will always be noise and variability in systems. That's like laws of thermodynamics, right? Like you just simply have those things. So let's talk about them real quick. There's a sender, a receiver, a message, a medium, and noise. The sender encodes a message to transmit over a medium where it's affected by noise until it's received and decoded at the far end by the receiver. Those components will always be there, those 5 components. The encoded thing that we choose to use, which can be a language, or at the most simple level for systems, we call them protocols. Protocols govern the way that communication occurs. That's what a protocol is. Protocol is the rules that govern the way that communication occurs, right? So the protocol has to be agreed on. The protocol here, what we're doing here, is essentially me speaking in English and you guys either typing back to me in English or talking in English. Hey, Hector, how's it going? Hopefully this stuff's useful to you. But a sender, a receiver, a message, and medium, noise, those will always be there. The reason I put a TX next to sender is because typically in engineering, and especially in electrical engineering flow and network engineering flow, you will always see TX as the transmitter. And then on the far side, receiver will always be RX or receiver. This is super useful in when you do signal engineering, which I teach a lot of signal engineering as well. That's kind of my background is in signal engineering. I did a lot of ham radio and wireless networks in college, early 2000s, right? I used to go to Radio Shack and buy stuff. And actually, that's all I can tell you. If you guys want to talk about it in Discord ever and you want me to talk about things that are somewhat questionable, I will tell you this, though. This is a fun little, you can go look this up for the FCC. FCC Part 15 only applies to when you want to work in the unregulated spaces that are generally acceptable, like 2.4 and 5 gigahertz. What I mean by that is Part 15 of the FCC says you will not interfere with anything else. If you go and look at the FCC regulations within your home, you're allowed to test any signal as long as it doesn't go more than 60 feet out of your home. So it is perfectly legal to be an American. I can only speak for Americans, guys, and I can only tell you what the FCC says. You can build things in your own home that do affect other signals on purpose. However, they cannot leave your home, right? So anyways, I'm just going to tell you that you can go get those pieces of equipment out there, and that's all I can really talk about, as far as that goes. But that is something that I used to do and have a background in, right? And some of you guys are pretty involved with ham radio, and I used to do a lot of ham radio when I was younger. So, yeah, Enzo Bear said I'm not American. Well, I can tell you FCC applies to American airspace too, so that's kind of good. All right, so sender, receiver, message, medium, and noise. And I challenge my students. Nobody's ever come back and told me they found something simpler, but find a model simpler than this that works. I don't think you can. You'll always have these component pieces. All right. So if engineering can model communication for us, and we just did all the things we said earlier, we have individual pieces, we can talk to just the sender for a long time and just the receiver for a long time and just the message for a long time? How do we put headers on the message, and how do we ensure that it's encoded correctly on the line, and all these kind of things, right? And then what is the line? Is the line a piece of copper with electrons that are affected by both electromagnetic interference and friction, or is it optical, right? You've got some kind of photons that are not affected by friction anymore. Well, not meaningfully, but there is some friction. And then also they can pass by each other without any ill effects. Or are we talking about free air space where you've got electromagnetic and radio frequency wave? So it's a electro and magnetic frequency for radio waves, and what's the implications of that? And there's all these things that we could then start to talk about, right? We're not getting into that right now, but I do want you to understand that with engineering, we can model communication, and then we can talk about each component piece like we were talking about earlier. What happened? I think there's a power limit, not a distance. I can run my radar array at band, but it has to be extremely low power. Yeah. We could get into all kinds of things with this, right? Especially when we start talking about the limits of any individual piece of this, right? But that's one of the reasons I tell you guys, when you're engineering things, if you don't want to re-engineer things, one of the things we always do is follow the rules of the protocol. If the protocol says that the signal can only go so far at certain power bands and decibel losses and those type of things, then we trust it and we stay within those rules. And it's much like buying a car. If you buy a little, you buy like a little Pinto, an old Ford Pinto or whatever those things were, and you take it outside and you get that thing up to 160 miles an hour, which would probably be real hard. You'd probably have to be going downhill. And then the wheels fall off it. Well, what the hell? Like, you can't, the people you can be mad at are yourself. You can't be mad at the people that designed the thing. They designed the thing to go like 50 miles an hour, maybe tops, right? Same thing with like a Volkswagen Bug. What does that thing go, like 55, 60? So my point in saying all that is, I've seen some faster, don't get me wrong, but my point in saying that is if you follow the rules of the protocol, then everything works. If you stray or push the boundaries, then obviously we start to get into where communication breaks down, and there's all these things that we talk about as we get into it. Anyways, we'll get into those here in a second. But engineering can then, so we modeled communication, but we can model a data flow. This is actually the data flow of an OSI model. OSI model is a 7-layer model that we use in networking. I teach out of this thing all the time, right? This is one of my main teaching ones here. And you've got host 1 over here and host 2 over here, and the data are going to flow down from the application layer, getting more and more information added to them as they go down. At each layer, we add information as what we call a PDU, a protocol data unit. We come down here, and at the transport layer, we start to apply headers to the data, and the headers inform only the other side at the exact same layer things about what's going on. Well, there's a little bit of shakiness to that, in that the network layer, the header for the packets for IPv4, and well, IPv6 as well, but IPv4 is what we mostly deal with now. Probably like 99% of traffic is still IPv4, but here, especially in internal systems, Kubernetes and that kind of stuff, but here, the packet does tend to know what the transport layer protocol is. It does have a field for that typically, but anyway, so then what happens is the communication occurs across as it flows down, and it's almost like we're in the box building business. We have data that are flowing down, we get to transport layer, and we take a box and we put a box on it and put a label on it for the transport layer on the other side, and then it goes down to the next layer, and it gets a header applied to that, and that's just putting that box in another box, and it's just these headers that keep coming out. And I tell people, if you want to dig into these and understand these, I would go into looking at go get into a Wireshark session and track what's going on inside your system, right? And then we get down here and we can model the data flow, and we could sit here and talk all day about any individual component piece of this, which again is one of those nice things about modeling that engineering gives us, and down to our physical layer and how we actually send the data flow of bits across the network. We always have some kind of drum beat and kind of thing that occurs to ensure that we're on the same signal and all that kind of stuff. Okay. Also, hold on. So we're going to consider a scenario, but to consider that scenario, I'm going to take a break real quick. And I'm going to put my little hourglass up. Put my hourglass up. Where's he at? And I'm going to say quick break. Quick break and more engineering. I'm going to take 8 minutes. I'll be right back. Oh, I still got 4 minutes of my break left. Go take a little walk. Take a little bit of a walk. You guys stretch your legs. We'll get started here in a second. Or we'll get restarted here in a second. Realize I have so much extra time still. All right. Oh, by the way, our bot's working again, it looks like. Looks like our bot's talking trash down in the Discord with the best of them. Somebody better try to use my first name down there and see if it craps all over the place like the bot normally does. I think the bot will do that even if it doesn't have. So if you guys don't know, the bot calls an API, and we got a bot in our Discord that just talks shit in general. It's terrible, but I think it looks like he's getting it working again, so that's always good. That's always good. But I think even just in the generic version of it, it'll still work through the whatever it's going to say about me. Because sometimes it'll go out to an API, otherwise it's got canned responses. All right, let's stop that. We'll talk for a minute before I move on. But just going back to these other things, right? Engineering can model communication for us. It can model our data flow and how data are going to move through a system. And then we get down here, and I'll still give it another minute because I know people might have walked away and want a little bit of a break. But yeah, hopefully this will be useful to you guys. So this is, again, a talk that I gave this weekend at our big professional Linux users group annual conference. We just get a bunch of people together that are in the industry to talk about their different areas of what they do. And I'm going to now, still just generically talking about security and engineering, we're going to talk about the scenario where I want to get data from one side to another, right? From over here to over here. And I'm pretty sure I used the wrong principle there, but it doesn't matter. From one user, one system, one whatever, to one user, one system, one whatever on the other side, right? And I want to ensure that as we move that data between the two systems or users or whatever, that no one else can understand it, that no one else can change it, no one else or no other process, which again could be noise in a system. Noise is always trying to change things. And I want to ensure that it always arrives, so that's availability. Now, some of you may have looked at that and said, wasn't that CIA? Isn't that normal security thing that everybody always talks about? Yeah, it's a useful model for how we talk about securing things. Nobody else can see it. Nobody else can change it, or no process can change it. And then it's always there. It's always, sent and then received in the same time as we expected. Also, I apologize, guys. I can't turn my phone off because I'm on call right now, so you may hear my phone. All right. You may also see me looking over there and seeing if my system is doing things that I expect it to do. Okay. So consider this scenario. I want to move data. And this is that same communication model from earlier, but now I'm calling it the secure communication model. I've still got a sender. He's still encoding a message. I want to send that over some medium where it's affected by noise until it's received on the far side. So let's look at this real quick. The sender can verify that the receiver is the correct principal. Hold on. Hold on. All right, anyways, it doesn't matter. And so we can verify that the other side is who they say they are. Well, how would we do that, right? Like if I was just over here and I wanted to send to somebody else and I just wanted to know who they were, I guess somebody that I trust, if I trust somebody else, I can have that third party introduce us. That's how certificate authorities work. We trust a certificate authority that when we download the public version of a key about something, that they will only have given the private key to the person that they're supposed to. And then we can do third-party introductions that way. So that's confidentiality, right? Third party introduces us, and we know that the other side is who they say they are. There's a cryptographic process there that happens within TLS where we send from the public key, we encrypt data, we send it over to them, and only them with their private key would be able to decrypt the data and send it back to us. And that handshake occurs in both TLS 1.2 and TLS 1.3, which you can look up the NIST standard on that. There's a pretty good one for that. We have it in like Unit 9 of our security engineering course where we go deep into that and how that process works. But we can use a third party to prove that the other side is who they say they are. and we know that we're talking to the right thing. And then with that, because only they could possibly have that information and respond, we have what's called non-repudiation. We know that we talked to the right one. They can't say later that it wasn't them. So that's what non-repudiation is. And then we can also, as a sender, verify the correct logical addresses. We can use DNS to resolve layer 7 human readable addresses with layer 3 IP addresses that only they should have control of. We can use DNS security to ensure that nobody has gotten in between us and the DNS that we trust. We can only trust our own DNS if we want to within our systems, and we can only trust certain external DNS too if we wanted to. So there's a lot of DNS trust that we can do. I remember early on when I started out in the early 2000s, there were only 13 DNS root providers around the world. Did you guys know that? There was only 13 of them. The DNS top level. Now they're distributed all over the U.S. and all over the world, and you can go look that up and what the implications of that were. That actually happened right at the end of 2016, early 2017, in fact. Anyways, the receiver only listens to the correct. So over here on the receiver side, right? Like I've got a bunch of systems set up where you guys can connect into, but how do I keep all the rest of the world from connecting? Right? People try to connect into my servers every few minutes, right? All the time. Can we configure the time to live of the TLS handshake? Chris, you can configure a lot of that stuff. I've never configured the time to live of the handshake. What I have done is configure there's devices, typically firewalls, that will keep track of how many what we call embryonic connections, which are half open connections between two nodes. And that keeps one or two bad actors from trying to have too many half open TLS handshakes, because so you guys know, especially with TLS handshakes and TCP handshakes, there is a thing called with TCP we used to have the SYNAC attack where we would just leave open connections, but TLS is the same part of the handshake. Well, it's a different type of handshake, but it's still the same idea. We could leave them half open. So hold on. You can configure a lot within your protocols. I've never messed with changing the time to live of the handshake, though. You probably could. In fact, there's probably like a sysctl thing in Linux to do that, but I've never messed with that. No. So if there is, you'd have to go look into it. I've never seen it done either, but that's not to say it couldn't be done. I just haven't ever done it or messed with it. Now over here on the receiver side, the process where we only listening to addresses that we're supposed to and networks and ports. By the way, networks and if we're blocking certain IP traffic coming in, or if we're only blocking and listening on certain ports, those are both types of addresses. There's 4 types of addresses that we tend to deal with here, right? There is the human readable DNS to IP address mapping. At this layer, there's port mappings. So port mappings are 0 to 65,535, which is 2 to the power 16, in either TCP or UDP. So that's a type of address. So addressing up here DNS, addressing here port mappings, addressing here IPs, logical, hierarchical, and then addressing here, which are media access control, your MAC addresses, but they are not hierarchical. They're flat. They're like your name. Your name doesn't change when you move around the country, right? And they're always only next hop. Every time you see like a crime show and they're like, we're going to track them by their MAC addresses, you're like, oh, no, they're not. So the MAC address never leaves that network, never leaves the next hop. But I digress. It doesn't matter, right? We suspend disbelief for that stuff. The receiver can be hardened to only listen to what we expect. And that tends to be availability. But it's also confidentiality, I guess, in that sense too. The message can be protected. So as we send each individual component of that message, as it's coming down the stack and getting to the TCP layer, we actually do a few things to that message. So cryptographically, we're using, at that point in the TLS process, we're using symmetric keys. We're not going to go into it too much, but it's asymmetric keys first, and then we agree on a symmetric key and we use that. But the non-replayability of it is each individual component of that is encrypted, and then we also have a hash that's associated with it to ensure that it hasn't changed in transit. So it's both hashed and encrypted. Those are 2 different things. Hashes are just a weight of something. Like if I weighed this and then I sent it to you and I sent you the weight outside of the sending of the thing, and then when you got it, you could check the weight, and that would be a rough way to estimate that it hadn't been messed with. Could still be messed with, but I guess not. Yeah, Smitty. There's a lot with Macs. There's the product side of it, and then there's the unique identifier. Sure. But it never leaves the hop, so it's useless for, I guess, like the end-to-end communication of this. But all right, so then we can encrypt the message, right? Again, we can verify each part of it. That's hashing each part of the message, and that verifies the integrity that it hasn't changed. So the message itself can be modified, and that deals with, especially as we're talking about messages in general, there's 3 things we do to messages. We encode them, we compress them, and we encrypt them. We encode the message under the protocol, we compress it down to what it needs to be, and then we encrypt it if we need to in whatever the encryption is. Sometimes the encryption is part of the protocol encoding, right? But if we do that on this side, we need to undo it on the other side. So we decode, we decode, we decompress, and we decrypt things on the other side of whatever that looks like, right? So anyways, then there's the medium. The same channel can be reserved for the entirety of the communication. That's both confidentiality and availability typically. Tunnel can be then further established logically via encryption, like a IPsec on top of that. So we can have ensuring that TLS is actually happening at layer 4, but then IP security can also be happening at layer 3. And then we can have DNS security and other types of things happening that are also happening on the line between the 2 communications as well. So there's multiple layers of encryption that can be happening to this simple, secure model that we're using for communication, right? And then we're dealing with noise. And how do we deal with noise? How do we keep noise from affecting systems? This is I have a whole like 2 or 3 college classes that I teach on just the concept of dealing with noise, right? But we have bit level parity. So if bits are switched, we can know, and then we can have that pulled out and resent. The signal to noise ratio, we have calculations on when we send data, and this is why we follow the protocols, so we don't have to memorize all this stuff and track it all the time. But if we follow the protocols, it should work. But signal to noise ratio calculations deal with, there's a thing called the rules of 3 and rules of 10, and they deal with loss and gain of power in a system, right? You can go look those up if you want. It's called the rules of 3 and rules of 10. They deal with loss in a system, but signal to noise ratio, sometimes we have to insulate our cables depending on the types of things. Certain types of cables are affected by EMI more. Certain types of signals are affected by EMI more than others, right? Some of them aren't at all. Some of them can't be listened to for that. And then typically there are other things about that are decibel loss, and then whether the noise is near or far, right? Are things happening near or are they happening far away? All right. So again, without getting too far into it, the point is we can talk about any one of these things at length. We can go pull up papers on them. We can go look at technical implementations of them. We can capture the data that are flowing in our systems right now with like TCP dump and Wireshark or Ethereal, if you remember that. And you can actually get the, what's going on with these systems. Are these individual components doing the things that I expect them to, right? All right. So engineering can then secure the data flows. So again, as we were talking about the data coming down through a system and, at the transport layer inside this header, we start to use TLS 1.3. There's a handshake that happens between those nodes, and we talk about those in other talks where we get into each of these. At the physical layer, we can actually secure the flow of bits and ensure that things are flowing the way that we expect them to. We can ensure that things aren't captured between them. A lot of like SCIFs, if you ever work in a secure compartmentalized information facility for the government, which is SCIF, SCIF. SCIF. Yeah, anyways, that thing tends to only use fiber optic cables between them because it's not impossible to tap fiber optic cable, but it's much more difficult to, so something to think about. But yeah, so anyways, so engineering can help secure that data flow, and we can again talk about each of the different layers and where that occurs and how it actually occurs in your system. All right, and that's all cool and all, but again, the question of all this was why engineering, right? So we go back to something that I had kind of talked about before, Why engineering? Well, because it may surprise you, and this is more and more true as we go. Nobody's going to pay you to hack. And some of you might say, well, I got a friend that's on a red team. I guarantee your friend doesn't hack all day, because I've ran red teams, I know. What you do on red teams is a tiny little bit of hacking with a whole bunch of planning in front of it and a whole bunch of documenting after it. In fact, most of the times, if you actually do know anybody that's doing red teaming stuff, they probably complain about the amount of planning and amount of documenting they have to do. The actual adversarial scanning and running of the what we typically call pen tests and those kind of things, and our different DAST and different types of things that we do there, DAST, dynamic application security testing, those type of things are a very small part of the overall process of planning and documenting things. But just generally speaking, engineering is hacking, because we hack away at a system to get to work the way that we want it to. But we got to do a lot of planning before it and documenting after it. So as we talk about engineering, one of the things that I want you guys to know is you can get better at the planning part of it. That's a big part of it. And you can get better at the documenting part of it. That's a big part of it too. So why engineering, right? How do we apply planning to the front of our hacking? If I told you that engineering throughout the course of a day is a lot of just hacking away at a system until you get it to work the way you want it to, how might you apply some planning before that? And what might that look like if you're building a new version of like Rel 10 came out recently and Rocky 10 came out recently, and now you got to get new Rel 10 or Rocky 10 into your server environment, right? You have to be ready to produce that for your dev teams or whatever, so that they can test them and move forward on it and all that kind of stuff. Well, a big part of planning is you have to be able to model the high-level steps of new things that you're creating. So you take skills and previously learned things, and you figure out how to outline. Here's what it looks to build a server from scratch in our environment. Here's what I need. I need the ISO. I need to go download the ISO. I need to load that ISO up, or build out a, maybe I got Packer, or I've got some type of tool that turns that into an image and I can load it into Werewolf and then I can boot it to one of my nodes. Or maybe I have to actually connect over to the IPMI and bring up a hypervisor and load the ISO up into that hypervisor, and it's not even accurate to call it a hypervisor if it's just one node, but let's just say it's the IPMI tool, and then you get into the underlying system, and then you load that ISO up like a CD, and you boot the disk and you build the machine for the first time. And then once you've built it, maybe you capture the full image of what you want and use that to then deploy to future systems, and that becomes a golden image, and that gets patched and all these kind of things. That's outlining. The ability to write that out and outline that is tremendously valuable to you as an engineer. It's one of the things that I've always kind of done well at as an engineer, right? It's one of those skills that just worked for me well. You need to be able to estimate, and after you do that outline, you need to be able to estimate to your company and your boss and your other engineers that you work with, and maybe the admin team that you probably support as an engineer. You need to be able to estimate the time per task. And typically we use swags for that. Swags are based on previous knowledge. Anybody here remember what a swag is? Any of my guys that were here for the talks before know what a swag is? And then I used Scotty's chart. He was the Star Trek engineer, if you remember. I'm giving her all she can, Captain. And he said he would always double how long it took so he'd look like a hero. While that's funny on the show, it's not good engineering. Anybody remember what a swag is? No, I'm not getting anybody. It's a term that I heard at Lockheed Martin, and I've always loved it. A swag is when you don't know, but you think you know. A swag is a scientific wild-ass guess. It's a scientific wild ASS guess. Oh, I won't spell it. Stupid thing. All right. So estimation of time per task is critical. Predicting possible issues and problems that can come up. That is based on your previous knowledge, and then also being able to maybe lay out your failure modes and effects analysis, which is a very common way that as engineers we look at problems in a system, especially before the system's ever built. Failure modes and effects analysis can be applied before you ever build a system. That's one of the things that makes it super powerful. Yeah. So, Chris, you can use worst case, best case, and average case to figure out what your own personal scientific wild ass guess is. But I just always like that because somebody will be like, Scott, real quick off the top of your head, what is it? And I'm like, well, this is a swag, but here you go. Planning is something that came a lot in the different talks. Yeah, I think planning is big. All right. Failure modes and effects analysis is a way to look at problems that can come up. And I have talks where we talk about failure modes and effects analysis. And then you got to actually sit down and build the minimum viable product or the proof of concept for deployment. You got to build that system. Does that system take you 12 hours to build? Sure. But if you're building it out and then you're like, oh shoot, I need this other piece. Oh shoot, I need this other piece. Some of you guys were watching last night when I was working on my system, and I was over here. Where was I at over here? I was way over here in my notes. Sorry, my notepad is and I was adding these individual components, right? And then I put some notes for me for later. These are my very raw notes. We're going to get into note taking here in a second, but these are my very raw notes of what I was doing on stream last night as I was building the home lab to be back to what we needed, right? So minimum viable product or proof of concept deployment is building out that thing and being able to quickly build it again and again until you have it down to a repeatable process. So the project fits the fit for use and checks all boxes for capability. So somebody needs a Rocky or a new RHEL 10 or Rocky 10 box in our environment. It needs to be a Linux server running that operating system. That's a checkbox. It is Rocky 10. Boom. It needs to be it needs to have an IP address on the network. Okay, it goes and it checks one out from IPAM. What's our IP address management system? So boom, gets that, builds itself in the dev environment. Cool. It needs to be connected to, very common in Red Hat environments, it needs to be connected to our satellite. We need to be able to track it for inventory purposes. It needs to be in our satellite server. Okay, boom. I got that built in. It needs to be able to allow identity and access management for users to get on. So we got to connect like SSSD. So the tool is SSSD a lot of times nowadays, and that allows us to do Active Directory or LDAP type authentication, right? So all of that to say, I can set this all up and have all these things that check. This thing does those minimum things, and it's fit for use. It is not fit for warranty, though. And you say, what's the difference between fit for use and fit for warranty? Fit for use is is a server. It allows users to connect. It does this and this and this. Fit for warranty is that it doesn't really take any weight. You could almost call it like paper thin or janky, if you will. It is not designed. I always use the web server example. So what's a web server? Web server's on port 80, check. Web server serves out a page with a 200 when you go to the right path, sure. But what's fit for warranty is, does it do that when the 4,999th connection happens? But then when the 5,000th connection happens, it just falls over on the floor. That's fit for warranty. Fit for use is like, does the vehicle have 4 tires? Yes. Are they pumped up? Yes. But it's not. And does it turn on when it's got a key put in it and turned? Yes, once. But fit for warranty is, does it turn on the 15th time after you just turn it off and turn it on again? Well, I'm not building it for warranty. I'm not building it yet in the initial minimum viable product and proof of concept. I'm not building it to be rugged yet. I'm just building it to get it to work the one time. I had an engineer early in my career that said, Scott, as long as I can see it happen once, that's it. He was a software engineer. He said, if I can get it to happen once, toss it over the wall. Let the other guys productionalize it. That's what his job was to get it to work once. I'm like, that's a good methodology. That's a good thing to understand about what you're building. I had a different buddy who he literally had a team of about 100 people that followed him around as he designed stuff, and they just productionalized stuff he designed. And you say he was that good that he had like 100 people that followed? Yes, that's like their job was to be a team that followed around what this guy did. If I can ever get him to come talk, it would be really good. He did some really interesting stuff with satellites when I worked with him, because I worked downstream satellites over at Lockheed for years. But this one particular guy that we had, all he did was just build things and toss it over the wall to people. Anyways, why engineering? Actually, our program was about 500 people, and they loaned him out to a NASA program that we had, and they didn't want to give him back. They were like, no, 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 this guy's not coming back to you. I thought that was kind of funny. That was back in the day when you still had to go in the office. Nowadays, it would probably be easy to share him, but back then, like, they had to move him out of state to do some stuff. Anyways, it doesn't matter. So why engineering? Now we have to talk about documenting at the end of our hacking, right? So again, the process looks like this. Engineering is hacking with planning in front and documenting on the end. So when we get down to documenting, I always tell you guys, take notes in your terminal as you go. Your terminal is designed to take notes for you, and it's cheap. So it'll do that. Screen or tmux, whatever is your flavor of choice, can log in real time. You might as well use it. Pull commands and relevant information out to like Notepad++ or OneNote. Those are your raw notes. Those are like, I kind of think of those as like my level 2 notes. Level 1 notes are down in screen tmux. They're just always logging. I pull out commands and relevant things that I need. And then when I'm ready for like my third tier of documentation, I clean up and I prepare my initial documentation. That's the first thing that I'll show anybody in my company. Nobody in my company sees this unless they log into, I have systems running over here. Nobody will ever see what's going on in those systems unless they're like logged in as one of my like peers or whatever. The commands that I pull out, I might send that like within my team, but it's still really raw. And then I clean up and prepare the initial documentation, and that you need to learn Markdown or other documentation standard, whatever MediaWiki or whatever you guys use, and then you have to use it. So if you guys use Git for all your documentation, that's fine, but Markdown has to be used. If you're using Markdown on your team, that's what you have to learn how to use, right? And learn how to clean your stuff up that you're pulling raw out of the system and organize it and get it working. Once you have your initial doc, right? Like once I can push a button on a hypervisor and deploy my RHEL 10 or Rocky 10 server, once I can do that, I'm down here to my initial documentation. It's a basic thing. I push a button. And then I run redline operations over that, and I abuse the crap out of it. And what I mean by that is redline operations are you could give it to anybody in your organization that has similar permissions to you, and they just go through the documentation and it works first time. Most of you will very quickly find that you have all kinds of assumptions about yourself. You assume what permissions you have. You assume what directories you're in. You assume that you CD'd into these different things and then you didn't put in the documentation. So now people are trying to execute commands that you have that are relative, but they're not in the right directory. So redline operations allow you to draw red lines through physical docs in some cases, and then go back and get it working to where then you give it to like even a second person, and they run through it and it's clean. Once you have a document redlined and good, that's typically like a testing QA function if you have enough people on your team to go to that. Yeah, Fisherman, I saw you working on the bot. That's kind of funny. The bot is back to doing bot things, it sounds like, so that's kind of cool. All right, and then you produce training and operational activities from your documentation. You must assume no knowledge of the system. Even if somebody's got root level operator knowledge or operator permissions, you can't trust that they know your system. So you have to design things, we call this lowest common denominator. And you say, yeah, but nobody would ever have my system that didn't have a knowledge of root. And I say, yeah, I know, but guys, your red line has to be so good. You're running through your documentation has to be so clean that anybody can. In fact, it should get so good that you can just go automate it. But that comes from like an automation mindset later. But running over your documentation to where it's clean is actually a really good thing, and it'll get you ready for the next step, which is automation. But I don't really talk about that in this talk. Produce training and operational level activities. I like to use absolute pathing in my docs. You don't need to. You can use relative pathing. Just know the limitations of it. Know that if somebody fat fingers something, and this is a dangerous one. I tell people sometimes, because people will use absolute pathing, but then when people type stuff in, they'll use like makedir-p. And makedir-p, if somebody fat fingers the path, will still make it, right? Makedir-p just makes it no matter what. Makes all the parents to it, makes it even if they're wrong. So it's kind of there. Fisherman, you said documentation's easy with AI. Yeah, it helps with that for sure. I'm sure a lot of people are using that to clean stuff up. All right, so conclusion, right? Why engineering, right? I went through all that stuff. I talked about all these things and probably bored some of you out of your minds, and that's fine. Not everybody wants to be an engineer. Some people just want to do systems admin work. Like my wife is a help desk technician. That's all she ever wants to do. She's gonna do that for like 4 more years until she retires, and she never wants to do anything else. But some of you want to be engineers. So the final conclusion is, why engineering, right? We've talked about all these component pieces and learning and modeling and all this stuff. And I say, because engineering is worth good money, businesses need their processes to run, and we know how to do it. So, you know, it's one of my favorites right there. I like money. All right. So where do you go from here? If you watch this and you're like, hey, this is all good, this is interesting stuff, but where do I go from here? How do I focus on being a better engineer? I say the first rule of being a good engineer is wanting to be a good engineer. Like if you tell me, hey, Scott, I want to get wisdom, I would tell you, well, the first thing to do is start trying to learn wisdom, right? And your questions, find me on Discord, YouTube, Twitch. Let me show you guys something. Let's pull up the Twitch here, or the Discord real quick here. So we'll go look on the Discord here, and we'll scroll down. And let's say you were just like, Scott, some of that really basic stuff, I just want to know how to do some of that like systems engineering stuff, that but maybe not even for Linux. Again, just generic engineering. We have a bunch of certs here that are free. They're not our certs. They're just certs I know about out on the internet. And Six Sigma and Lean Six Sigma will really help you to get like a knowledge of how processes are improved in the world. Like, how do we take data and turn that data into bettering our systems and bettering all of our stuff? There's all kinds of other good things here that are useful, but specifically to this talk and specifically to things that we were doing there, those certs are really good, I think. Okay. Other than that, we have a lot of stuff going on in Discord. Let me show you guys some stuff. I do like to show you guys this. We got the Bash study group at 10 a.m. on Saturday. That's 10 a.m. my time. Your time, it'll be in your time. And then I started another one because people said, hey, we want to do late night Bash study. So I started another one at 10 p.m. So 10 a.m., 10 p.m. And you say, well, that's different times for me. Yeah, but one of those times is going to work for you, right? Either 5 a.m. or 5 p.m. or 2 a.m. or 2 p.m. Sometime, somewhere on planet Earth, that's going to work for you. So late night Bash studies there. Let me not gloss over this one because I think this is one of the most valuable things in our Discord. Sending Grounds is going to talk about interview prep and mock, and he works for Mang. So Mang is, you know, the new Fang. Yeah, midnight Bash sesh. For some of you, it might be midnight. Enzo, I think I'm on your time, so I think that's only 10 p.m. for us. I'm not going to stay up super late on that. I'm eventually going to hand this off to somebody else. I just started it because I know that people will do it. And then we have a pen tester that I know coming to talk about being a pen tester in the industry. So people that do want to do red team and do want to do that hacking component of it. And I hope he talks a lot about all the documenting and all the planning that goes into it. But he's going to come and talk to you guys on the 30th. So that's a couple weeks from now. But that is a free event. All of our events are free. You just go and hang out in there. The only thing I do ask, there are server rules, like don't be disruptive. Like if you go into the Bash group and he asks, hey, does anybody have anything? Fine, talk. But like if you go in there and they're talking through a problem and you just start blasting like Reveille or Retreat or something like that, then you're probably going to have some kind of problem, right? As far as getting timed out or something. But yeah, there's a lot of good talks, a lot of good stuff coming up, and we will keep putting those out because I think they're valuable to you guys. I think they help you guys figure out kind of what's going on, figure out where you want to go spend your time and that kind of stuff. So, all right. I am going to, then I got some messages to read, so I'll probably drop off of here, but I definitely appreciate you guys coming by. This talk will be just kind of like a closed up version of what I did for the Linux group. I may have varied a little bit in the way that I told it this time, but most of the stories are the same and most of that stuff's pretty similar. So, all right. I appreciate you guys coming. I will see most of you later on this week. Again, the wife's going out of town tomorrow. So aside from working and being on call, I probably am going to be on most of this weekend. I'm going to be working on building out the automation course. I'm going to be working on giving you guys more lab activities. I'm hoping to make the labs somewhat like useful for you guys to get in there and do stuff with them. But we'll see where we get with all that. So I appreciate you guys all coming by, and I will talk to some of you later.